Have you ever felt like you're walking down the street and there should literally be a camera crew following you? Admit it, we've all done it at some point. Or maybe you've mentally narrated your own morning commute like it's the opening scene of an indie film. Well, today we are diving right into this fascinating explainer on a phenomenon that is completely reshaping how we view ourselves and our relationships. We are unpacking main character syndrome.
So let's start off by asking ourselves a pretty fundamental question about how we navigate our daily interactions. Are you the star of your own movie, or is everyone else just an extra? I know, it sounds like a subtle distinction, but it completely changes how we treat the people around us. Is life this shared, collaborative experience, or is it a stage built entirely for your personal plot twists?
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be covering the Truman Show illusion to find exactly what the syndrome is, looking at the ego and narcissism spectrum, asking if this is talent or just algorithmic vanity, exploring the cost of empathy, and finally, how to reclaim the supporting role.
All right, jumping into part one, the Truman Show illusion, from passive paranoia to active narration.
To really understand where we are today, we've got to look back at when this was first studied. In 2008, psychiatrist Joel Gold and neurophilosopher Ian Gold studied and actually coined the Truman Show delusion. And yeah, this was directly inspired by the 1998 Jim Carrey film where a man discovers his entire life is a televised reality show. But as you'll see, that 2008 clinical phenomenon is vastly different from the massive main character trend that exploded on TikTok in 2020.
Now, this is absolutely crucial. Look at the stark contrast here between the clinical Truman delusion and modern main character syndrome. Patients with the Truman delusion genuinely and often fearfully believe they're trapped in a fabricated reality show against their will. It is a completely passive process. Main character syndrome, on the other hand, totally active. It's this cognitive posture linked to an inflated ego where an individual actively wants to be the star, aggressively curating their life to be watched and admired.
Moving on to section 2, defining main character syndrome, narrative narcissism in everyday life.
So what exactly is it? Essentially, main character syndrome is a cognitive posture where an individual consistently views themselves as the central protagonist of every single situation, treating everyone else as mere supporting actors. Now, to be clear, it's not a formal diagnosis in the DSM-5, but it is an incredibly powerful behavioral pattern. It's rooted in what psychologists call the spotlight effect, our natural egocentric bias where we overestimate how much people notice what we do, but it's amplified into this constant, overarching personal narrative.
Be honest, do you ever catch yourself doing any of these things? Like romanticizing the totally mundane, or mentally adding a dramatic soundtrack while you pour your morning coffee? Maybe curating your outfits purely for their visual narrative potential, or feeling genuinely, deeply offended when a dinner conversation shifts to a friend's promotion instead of your week. It really comes down to this assumption that you take up a massive amount of space in the minds of total strangers.
Section 3, the ego and narcissism spectrum. Where exactly does confidence end and egocentrism begin? So is this simply a manifestation of extreme egocentrism? Well, the crucial point here is that this behavior exists on a sliding scale. It bridges the gap between empowering self-worth and clinical narcissism. Over on the left, you've got healthy self-advocacy, setting boundaries, knowing your worth. Right in the middle is main character syndrome. That's a behavioral habit driven by a need for validation, where empathy gets a bit clouded. But then on the far right, you have narcissistic personality disorder, which is a diagnosable clinical illness requiring a deep psychological need for supply, and it's characterized by a severe lack of empathy.
The big dividing line here really comes down to one thing: the distress factor. A major differentiator is that people with main character syndrome often feel distress or guilt when they suddenly realize they've been acting selfishly. That means their capacity for empathy is fully intact. If you recognize that you've been hogging the spotlight and feel genuinely bad about it, that self-awareness means you are for sure not dealing with clinical NPD. It's an acquired coping mechanism, not a permanent lack of empathy.
Which brings us to part 4, talent or algorithmic vanity, the sociological engine driving the narrative.
Get this, sociological studies show that a staggering 67% of 18 to 24-year-olds actually recognize these main character behaviors in themselves. 67%. That incredibly high number suggests we're not just talking about isolated cases of genuine, once-in-a-generation talent justifying extreme self-confidence. We are looking at a massive systemic cultural shift.
So what's driving this? Well, platforms actively cultivate this mindset through design choices that fuel vanity with constant blinding validation. Think about the massive POV or point of view storytelling trend on TikTok. Users are explicitly encouraged to film ordinary, everyday moments as if they're dramatic cinematic scenes. The algorithm then takes this dramatized vanity and rewards it with measurable validation, likes, views, comments. That validation is so continuous and so bright that it fundamentally reshapes how people perceive their real-world value. It becomes less about actual talent and way more about who can stage their life the most effectively.
Sociologists point out that in our current era of anomie, which is basically a fancy word for a lack of collective meaning, creating your own personal mythology is actually a coping mechanism. Traditional structures like close-knit communities and grand societal narratives are kind of dissolving, so individuals are forced to build their own meaning. Narrating your life as a fiction and always casting yourself as the hero overcoming obstacles is really a desperate search for control and identity in a deeply fragmented world.
Part 5, the cost of empathy. What happens when the supporting cast fades? There's this quote from the research that just hits the nail on the head. You start to feel like a supporting cast member in someone else's emotional Netflix series. It perfectly illustrates the exhausting reality for friends and family members who are reduced to basically holding the boom mic in someone else's one-person show. Imagine a friend who flops onto your couch, delivers a dramatic monologue about their terrible day, and literally never once asks how yours was. It might be charming at first, but eventually it is just draining.
And this is the real tragedy of narrative narcissism. By trying so hard to make yourself the star, you end up emotionally isolating yourself from the very people who care about you the most. You start treating your friends' very real struggles as minor subplots to your main storyline. You deliver monologues instead of having actual dialogues. And in the worst cases, people even use their past traumas as a written script to justify bad behavior or avoid taking accountability, totally ignoring the full humanity and autonomy of the people they might be hurting.
Okay, finally, part 6, reclaiming the supporting role. How we can go about balancing the narrative. The good news is you can absolutely still maintain healthy main character energy for your own self-worth while actively practicing the art of being a supportive extra in someone else's triumphs. The antidote here is intentional recentering. Go to a dinner party and actively choose that you aren't going to tell your absolute best story. Truly listen to a friend without just waiting for your turn to speak. Recognize that every single stranger you pass on the street is living a story just as wildly complex as yours. Or dive into your family history and realize you are part of a rich, ongoing collective narrative, not just a standalone solo act. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to really ponder the next time you find yourself trying to mentally direct your own life. If everyone is the main character, who is left to be the audience? True connection requires us to step out of the spotlight sometimes and simply witness the beauty of someone else's story. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.